Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a Lab 1 video for DHCP in Windows Server 2003. In this video, we're going to take a look at several things, but we're going to focus on the installation process of DHCP in Active Directory. First, we're going to take a look at how to actually install the tool. Then we'll go into the configuration and options, and we're going to talk about integrating DHCP within an Active Directory environment. And then after that, take a look at the rogue DHCP server problem that sometimes comes up. After we finish that, we're really going to focus the majority of this video on the DHCP scope options, what they mean, how to configure them, and how they're different in Server 2003. After we finish the scope options, we're going to go over to the DHCP client, actually the machine we're sitting on now, and we're going to take a look at the different settings that we can configure from this client machine. We'll then conclude this video by taking a quick look at reservations, how you can use reservations on your network and why you might want to use them. All right, let's take a quick look here before we get started at our network diagram here. Okay, and what we're looking at right now, this is just a general network diagram of the current environment that we're sitting at now. Okay, and this is the machine we're sitting at, XP1. This machine has an IP address of 192.168.1.1. And we're on this small little 3-computer network with an XP machine and then 2 servers running Server 2003. Now, Server 1 is running Active Directory and DNS. This machine we're really not going to be interacting with throughout this video. Server 2, however, this is where we're installing DHCP, and this is where we're going to focus our attention on just to make sure that you get a good comfort level with what's going on. Okay, so right now what we're going to do from XP1, we're going to form a remote desktop connection over to Server 2 so we can manage this machine remotely. Okay, so like I said, we'll form that remote desktop connection, and we're just going to supply the NetBIOS name Server 2. So I click Connect here, and this takes us on over to Server 2 in our little network environment that we're describing. Now, first thing that has to happen, you have to install DHCP on your computer. Okay, and sometimes what happens if you go here to Administrative Tools, you'll see this DHCP icon, and it's not necessarily installed. So I want to, reiterate that to you. If you see this icon and you click it and you get some sort of could not connect to DHCP server message, it's very likely that you don't have DHCP server installed. And what you need to do is follow along with what we're going to do right now. Go up to your control panel, then add or remove programs, and you need to add the DHCP component. Okay, so to do that, like I said, you go to Add Remove Programs, click Add Remove Windows Components, and this is going to take you into the sub-components that you can install in addition to the base Windows Server 2003 operating system. Now, we've already installed DHCP, so we're only going to open this up, take a quick look at where it's located, how you install it, and we're just going to cancel out of this. But it's very straightforward. You check a box, click Next, okay, click Finish, and then when you're done there, it will ask you for a CD along the way, but when you're done there, it's installed. Okay, so we'll go through this process. First, you got to find it, okay, and it's located under Networking Services. And I want to stress to you here, if you see that this checkbox is checked, there's a gray background, there's a reason for that. And that's because if we open this up, we see that only DHCP is installed and not all of these other services here. We definitely don't want to install these other services. It'll slow our system down and lead to other security problems as well. Okay, so what I'm talking about is if you select this box, see how it has the white background now? That's selecting everything within there, okay, and that's not what we want. So I'm just going to cancel this, and then I'm going to cancel this as well so we don't save these settings. Okay, but that's all that you need to do in here is just select DHCP, okay, then click OK, Next, and Finish. And it's going to ask you for your CD, and you'll be all set. Okay, like I said, we just had to cancel it because we already installed DHCP, so we're going to close this down. And then we're going to manage DHCP by opening up the DHCP console. And I have a shortcut here, but you could also get to it just by going through Administrative Tools and then opening up DHCP. Now, once we're within DHCP, let's take a look at what we're dealing with here. This management unit on the outside is called a console. Okay, and this console allows you to manage one or several different DHCP servers within it. Currently, right now, we see just one DHCP server, okay? And the reason we see just one is because there's only one in our network, and we've only added one server. If we had another server, and we'll see this in future labs, we can right-click here, click Add Server, and add the actual server. So we could add server 3 here and then click OK, and it would add that server here and allow us to remotely manage that server as well. Okay, let's focus in here on server 2. The first thing we have to do is get this red arrow from being down and basically make that go away. We need to enable this server. Okay, and to do that, we need to authorize this server within Active Directory. Okay, so we're going to go here to Manage Authorized Servers, and I just right-clicked on DHCP up here. Okay, and by the way, I didn't point this out, but the status here says Not Authorized. Okay, and this is a new feature in Windows 2000. Okay, not just Server 2003, it's in Windows 2000 as well. What you need to do is authorize all of your different DHCP servers that are part of your domain, because we don't want what are called rogue DHCP servers out there giving out bad IP addresses. So I click Authorize here, and now you see it asks for the name or IP address of this server. So let's try out the name, see if we can't get that to work. We click OK here. Notice how it automatically populates the name and the IP address. Okay, and it does that just by consulting a DNS database. Okay, and now it tells us the DHCP servers could not contact Active Directory. And I've found before that this is often plagued with all sorts of little errors and messages. So let's try this again before we start any sort of troubleshooting, because there really shouldn't be any reason why we can't contact that Active Directory. Okay, so type the name or IP address of the DHCP server you want to authorize, and that's going to be, let's just type in our IP address here. We click OK, click OK again. Okay, and once again, we still can't contact the Active Directory. So let's take a quick look over here and see why that might be. So this may happen. So I like to include these as part of the video so you can get a feel for how you might troubleshoot the situation, on your own network. So what we're going to do is go to our network connections, and I want to take a look at our network card here, see what our settings are currently here. Okay, so the IP address looks correct on our system. The mask is good. The default gateway is not important to us, but it is correct as well. And then our preferred DNS server is correct at 192.168.1.100. And that's typically how we'd be contacting that server. So next, I'm going to test out DNS here. I'm going to type in nslookup. And I want to get a feel for what type of message it gives us. And that's typically a good sign. server1.wbc.local. We have contacted that name server. Let's see if we can resolve server 2. Okay, and server 2 is the machine we're sitting on, recall, and everything looks good here. So there's really, in my estimation, no reason why this doesn't work. So what we're going to try doing, we're going to close DHCP. Let's reopen DHCP again, and let's test it out, see if we can't get it to work better now. Okay, here's another thing I've often done too. I'm going to try to delete this machine. Okay, notice it's deleted from the console. Now I'm going to re-add this machine here again. Okay, so I'm clicking Browse. I'm just going to type in server 2. Okay, enter the name and password of an account with permissions. Okay, so for some reason I think we're logged on, looks like we're logged on locally to the server, which would be causing a problem. Let's back out of this so you get a feel for what mistake was made here. Now, when I logged on using a remote desktop connection, the username and password were automatically entered in, so I didn't enter that. But if we back up here, I'm going to close this connection, and we'll connect back over to it again. Here's server 2. When I'm looking at these options here, I see that a username and password is specified, but the domain was not specified. So what happened was I was able to log on to server 2, but I was logging on locally instead of logging on with a domain user account and password. So what I need to do is specify the domain name, okay, and then specify the domain administrator's username and password. Okay, and administrator is the same. Password slightly different though. So we'll do that. We'll connect. Let's see if this connects us over. This remote administration logon tool doesn't seem to work real well. Even though I specified WBC before, it still didn't give me it. So I'm selecting WBC here, the administrator username, and then password. WBC, by the way, is the name of the Active Directory domain. It's Wired Brain Coffee. Okay, now we are able to log on. And you see that we got a little bit different desktop background. It's a blue background here. Same server. We're still sitting on server 2. And I think we're going to have much more luck now when we open up DHCP. Okay, Administrative Tools, DHCP. Okay, and now when we take a look, looks exactly the same. We still have the red down arrow. But when we right-click here and go to Manage Authorized Servers, I think we're going to have much better luck. Okay, so let's type in our IP address. Okay, and this is the name of the server or IP address that we want to authorize, not the one we're connecting to. Okay, so here's the name of the server that needs to be authorized. I click OK, and this time it looks like it's going off without a hitch. Okay, so it didn't tell us this specifically before, but the reason we weren't able to authorize it was because of an authentication problem. We were trying to authenticate to that domain controller and authorize the server, yet we didn't have domain administrator privileges. Okay, so I'm going to select this. Click OK. Okay, and it says the name server host has already been added to the list of DHCP servers. This comes up a lot, okay? Don't worry about this. You still need to go through this process. Once we click OK here, click refresh a couple times. Sometimes it will change this for us. It'll actually change the red down and get rid of the red down arrow, but a lot of times we have to actually close this and reopen it. What I'm going to do is just restart the service, see if that works. I'm just stopping it and restarting it. Now we're waiting for it to start back up. Okay, and now you see that we have the green up arrow here. Okay, so this server is ready to roll. The only thing we need to do now is add a scope. Okay, so as far as Active Directory is concerned, this server is capable of giving out IP addresses. Now let's expand a little bit upon what we were talking about before when I mentioned rogue DHCP servers. Now this is a problem that's been in NT4 and previous operating systems where you actually have a DHCP server that's placed onto a network, and this server, usually not in a malicious way, but a lot of times a student will be setting up a DHCP server or an administrator setting up a test network to test some stuff out. When you enable a DHCP server, that machine is live and it's capable of giving out IP addresses to any machine that's on that same physical network. So even though we know this is our production DHCP server and this is the one we want to use, other DHCP servers will give out IP addresses on that network. So it's real important to monitor these servers. Well, in 2000, now they have a feature called Rogue DHCP, and what it's basically doing is going out there, and any server that's not authorized, it shuts down that service on that particular machine. So it'll literally go out to the machine, shut down the DHCP service, so it's not capable of giving out bad IP addresses. So now it's not perfect. It only works with member servers, machines that are part of the domain. So if somebody were to do a fresh install of 2000, make it a DHCP server, it's not going to have any luck shutting down that particular one because it's a completely different environment. Okay, anyway, let's move forward. Let's talk about the scope. This is one of the most important pieces. And I think before we start rolling with this, it's important that we think about planning this out. Okay, so we're going to go back over here to our diagram. And I encourage you to do this as well on your own networks. This isn't something you just start doing. You should have a plan for how you want to set this up. So in looking at this network, we do see that we want to use the IP addressing scheme of 192.168.1.100. Okay, we're using a 24-bit subnet mask, so that makes this portion here the network ID. Okay, and by default, that's going to give us 254 different IP addresses between 1 and 254. Okay, so that's what our defaults are. Now, some other things to consider. We should know what our default gateway is. Okay, and our default gateway in this situation is going to be right here, the internal network card of this ISA server. And this is a firewall diagram, but we really just have a Windows 2000 server here with two network cards. One network card goes out to the internet. One network card plugs into the same hub that these machines are plugging into. Okay, so it's no big thing here as far as this. The diagram maybe makes it look more complex than it is. Okay, but this is the default gateway right here. And this is an important concept to understand. The default gateway is always going to be the exit point of the network. Okay, and in this case, this is the near side interface. The default gateway will never be this side. for this network, because they have to be able to get to that IP address. Okay, so the IP address is 192.168.1.254. That's going to be our default gateway. Another thing, keep in mind, server 1 over here, server 1's running DNS. Okay, we didn't mention that except for in the, I think, lab setup video. So here, this server is running DNS. We'll have a scope option for that as well. So 192.168.1.100, this will be the IP address that we specify for DNS. Now, one other option we're going to have is for WINS. Okay, and we're not currently running WINS on this network. WINS is for typically legacy operating systems and applications, and that's anything that's older than Windows 2000. We're going to pretend that we have a WINS server installed here as well, okay, that we have the WINS service. So I'm just going to jot this in here real quick. Okay, so when we get to that scope option for WINS, it's going to be 192.168.1.100 as well. Okay, so these are the key numbers that we need. DNS, WINS, default gateway is right here. Okay, we need to know our range. And then the last thing we should think about are our exclusions. And exclusions are going to be, well, we've got that range between, let's say, 1 and 254. What IP addresses do we want to exclude from that range? And IP addresses that we need to think about and definitely exclude, well, 200, we need to exclude this IP address because we're going to assign this statically. Servers, printers, okay, routers, they're typically going to have static IP addresses. Even though we're using a DHCP server to dynamically assign IP addresses, we're going to use static IP addresses on these types of machines. So here are 3 IP addresses that we're going to focus on putting exclusions in for: 200, 100, and then .254. Okay, let's go take a look now, get started with this actual configuration. Okay, so here we're sitting here, and what we're going to do is right-click, and then we're going to go down to New Scope. Okay, and this takes us through a little wizard, fairly simple to set up. Name, this should just describe what the scope is going to be for, and we'll just say it's for the WBC internal network. Okay, click Next. Now is where we specify the IP address range. Okay, and this is 192.168.1.1 through 192.168.1.254. Okay, now down below we have the opportunity to specify a subnet mask. This is the default subnet mask for this range, but we could use pretty much anything we want. We will specify and keep this default mask because this is what we want to use. This mask will allow us for, like we said before, 254 different computers on the network. Okay, if you did want to change the subnet mask, you have the ability to do it by the length of the subnet mask. Okay, notice when I change this down, it changes this as well. Okay, or you have the ability to just change it like using the dotted decimal format. Okay, and by me changing it to 0, it's going to change this to 24. I just need to click into a different field. Okay, and see how it registers that now. Okay, so this looks good. Click Next. Now we need to add those exclusions. Okay, and sometimes you may have a range of exclusions, like in the Windows 2000 videos, for example. I believe we excluded everything from 200 and up, and we just pretty much reserved 200 through 254 for all of our servers. And that's pretty much a good plan. I would recommend that you do have a set aside range that you use to exclude. It's not what we have here, so let's stick with it. Okay, and it'll also kind of give you maybe a little bit more insight into how this interface works. Because I don't have a range and I just have individual IP addresses, see how I have the starting IP address and the ending IP address as the exact same number? Okay, that'll just add this one number right here. And then I'm going to have to do the same thing for 200. Okay, and I'm going to have to do the same thing for 254. Okay, so now I have 3 different IP addresses here that are specified. All 3 of these individual IP addresses will be excluded. So just to clarify what that means, here's our complete IP address range. Once this DHCP server is enabled, it's going to start giving out IP addresses between 1 and 254. However, we don't want it to give out the IP address 100, 200, or 254 because those are taken by our server, and IP addresses can only be used on one computer on a particular network. So that's why we've excluded those 3 specific IP addresses. Next, it comes time for the lease duration. Now, and typically your lease duration on a normal desktop server network, you're fine leaving this at 8 days. Okay, and this lease duration, this really controls how long a client can use an IP address. Okay, so if we have it at 8 days, that means that this computer, when your computer gets an IP address from the DHCP server, it can use that IP address for up to 8 days. Once 8 days has expired, that IP address will no longer be valid, and this machine won't be able to connect to the network. So it's very important then that these machines are constantly updating and refreshing that lease. Okay, and the way this works in DHCP is after 50% of the lease interval. Okay, so we have an 8-day lease interval. At 50%, that would be 4 days. After 4 days, the DHCP client is going to try to renew its lease with the DHCP server. Okay, if the DHCP server is available, great. It renews it for another 8 days. After half that time once again, then it's going to try to renew it. And the reason we do it at such a short interval, 50%, well, if that DHCP server is not available, we can contact it again the next day and the day after. We've got a little bit of flexibility. The IP address is such a critical piece. You know, without the IP address, you're not talking to anybody. We want to make sure that we have plenty of leeway there so we can, you know, if the server is not available, we can still use that IP address, okay, which is kind of important to point out. Don't forget, the lease is for 8 days. So after 4 days, if I can't contact the DHCP server, that's okay. I can still use that IP address. It's not like I have to quit using it because the DHCP server is not available. After the 5th day, I can still use that IP address if the DHCP server is not available. Hopefully, I'll be able to connect to it before the 8-day lease period expires. Okay, and if that's the case, then there'll be no problems here. Now, things to consider, why you might want to shorten this lease. Nowadays, we've got a lot more laptops that are out there on networks, and we also have wireless networks. Okay, and if you have a situation where you've got 254 IP addresses like we do, and you set your lease time to 8 days, imagine if you had an internet cafe, for example. With an internet cafe, people would come in, they would basically plug their laptops in, they'd want to connect to the internet, whether it's wireless or just regular, they'd get an IP address from you, surf around for a couple hours, whatever, leave, but they don't give that IP address back to you. Basically, they're going to hold on to that IP address for 8 days until the lease time expires. And the problem with that, well, you may have more than 254 customers in any one given day. Okay, so if that were the case, or even if you had 254 customers over the time span of 2 or 3 days, you're going to run out of IP addresses, and those new customers will not be able to connect out to the internet or just even to the local network. So in a situation like that, you're much better off shortening this lease time. Okay, you could even shorten it to 2 hours if you wanted to. Okay, and there's also an option. We covered this a little bit in the concepts video, but there's an option you can specify that will have the clients give back the IP address when they shut down their computer. And that's a good idea for that internet cafe example that I described before. Okay, the disadvantage of shortening this lease time to something like this, well, there's going to be a lot of chatter on the network. Imagine just a normal desktop network where you've got 200 desktop users out there and you have the lease time expiring in 2 hours. Well, every hour, 50% of the interval, those machines are going to be out there trying to contact that DHCP server again and re-up their lease. And it's just not necessary. So you need to take a look and decide how your network is set up and configured and base your lease time on that. Okay, for our purposes right now, we're going to leave the default 8 days, 0 hours, and 0 minutes. Okay, now, additional scope options. Do we want to do these right now? And we're going to say yes to this, but you can always go back and change these or add to these later. So we say yes. The default gateway, remember that's the ISA server. This IP address is just going to be exactly how we have it mapped out. 192.168.1.254. So you enter that in, click add, and then our domain name and DNS servers. Okay, now you don't have to fill out the parent domain if you don't want to, but the IP address is definitely important. So what we want to put in here is the IP address of the preferred DNS server. And you can add several DNS servers if you want to. In our case, we only have that one DNS server, so we don't need to do that. Okay, and up here, what you would use If you want to add on this DNS suffix, you can add this on. This is the actual domain name that we're working with here locally, wbc.local. So this will add this DNS suffix on to any computer that basically broadcasts out there and is looking for an IP address. All right, the Win server. Now we're not running Wins, but I told you before that we were going to pretend that we had this service running on the DNS server as well. So then we're just typing in the exact same IP address. This is the IP address of the Wins server. Okay, and then it's asking us if we'd like to activate the scope now. Now, if you're not sure that you want to activate it now, of course you click no. It's okay to activate it. The only thing you have to keep in mind is as soon as you activate it, this scope is live. Okay, so when I've done this now, any computer that might be booting up on the network is going to pick up an IP address. And like we were talking about before, if you did something like this and you're just kind of goofing around, testing it out, you want to get a feel for settings, well, you may have actual people out there on the network who are booting their computers up or their lease is expired, and they may pick up IP address information from you. Okay, and this IP address information may not be consistent with what they need to connect to the corporate network. So that's the only thing you really have to be cautious of when you're activating these scopes. Okay, so now that we look at this, let's take a closer look at what we see here. We have our server name, we have the name of the scope. Underneath the scope, we have address pool. Now you can see here that this gives us the address range for all the different IP addresses that we're given out, and then also our exclusions here, 100, 200, and .254. Address leases, there's nothing here right now. We'll check back here in a second, but this is going to show anybody who has leased an IP address from this DHCP server. Reservations, also nothing here right now. We'll set this up here in a second and show you what this looks like and also explain what it's for. And then scope options. Here you see the different scope options that we configured. These options were all done through the actual wizard. The only one you didn't see specifically was this, which was automatically set in conjunction with 044, the Win servers. Okay, and your default option here is what's called hybrid mode. We won't go into this right now. This is more of a Lab 6 Wins topic. Okay, so we have all of these scope options here. If you want to modify this, let's say you catch a typo here or something, or maybe we move our Win server to a different address, we just need to go here to Properties. This opens up all the scope options, and now you can see we can just select this, and we can change this to anything that we would like. Okay, so we add this one, and if this one's invalid, we just remove it. Okay, even though it's here, it's not going to be part of the list. When we click apply here and then OK, you'll see that the only address included is 1.150 at this point right now. Okay, so pretty cool as far as how that works. All right, let's go take a look from the client perspective, see what we can't do here. Okay, so far what we've covered, we've gone through the DHCP installation, rogue DHCP servers, the scope options. Now we're down to DHCP client configurations. Let's talk about what we can do here on our local system. Okay, what we're going to do is just go to our network connection. So right click My Network Places, go to Properties, and we're going to manage this network card. So I'm right clicking, going to Properties again, and I'm going to take a look at the TCP/IP properties of this card. Now, to get this lab going and start everything off properly, we had to use static IP addresses because DHCP was not configured. Now, however, if this is configured properly, I should be able to obtain an IP address automatically and still be able to connect out to the different servers that I need to on the network. Notice you do have the option to obtain an IP address automatically, but keep your entries here static. I don't really see a huge need for this. Typically, you want to configure these and automate both the IP address assignments as well as the DNS server address assignments. Now, when I click OK once, click OK a second time, it's going to take away that static IP address, and now it's going to go across the network. It's going to broadcast out looking for a DHCP server. Okay, assuming that one is out there on the network, what it's going to give me is IP address information. And you can see right here that I received 192.168.1.1, 24-bit mask, default gateway. Only problem I have here is this is the exact same information I had before. You know, maybe it's not working. Well, what you need to do is type in ipconfig all to get a more detailed description of what you've been assigned. And if we look here, let's go up to the top first. Okay, we have the host name and node type and all this stuff, still not going to make much sense. To double check this, always go down here and check and see if DHCP is enabled. And we see that it says yes. We also see that here's our DHCP server, and now we can start putting two and two together. Oh, this must be working out here because here's our DHCP server assignment. Oh, look, here's the Win server assignment that we changed to 150. Okay, and all this other information is correct as well. Down here at the bottom tells us when the lease was obtained, November 5th, 2004 at 154. And we have this lease for 8 days through November 13th at 154 as well. Okay, so it kind of gives you good information as far as your complete lease and the DHCP client configurations. Now, if we need to troubleshoot this, and this will happen from time to time, maybe you boot your system up, and like with laptops, for example, you might not have it plugged in when you first boot your system up. What you can do is run a series of commands based off of the ipconfig command. Okay, and you may or may not be familiar with this. You probably are. ipconfig is going to demonstrate your IP address to you. Well, ipconfig release will release this DHCP information, basically getting rid of it, throwing it away. And you see here that now our entries are just 0000000, and we have no default gateway or anything. Well, to rebroadcast out on the network and try to contact that DHCP server again, we can just do an ipconfig /renew. And doing the renew will take a little bit of time, but it's just initiating that broadcast process out again. And you can see that we picked up that same IP address and all the same IP address information. Okay, and running ipconfig all will once again confirm that. Okay, DHCP is enabled. Here's the server you contacted. Here's all the same information once again. Okay, another thing, take a look at the lease. We released that lease before and we just renewed it. And it's not much different, but match up the times 156 and 59 seconds to 157. This clock just turned over. So we actually started the lease over again. So if I did this again in another 10 minutes, you would see this lease starting at 206 and ending at 206. So that's what happens when you do that release. You're basically stopping the lease. Okay, the last thing we're going to take a look at in this first video is reservations. Okay, and reservations, they're not very commonly used, but reservations can be used if you still want to use DHCP, but you want a system to always have the same IP address. Okay, and things that come to mind, maybe a printer. For some reason you want to use DHCP and take advantage of some of the automated features, but at the same time you want to make sure that it gets the same IP address, so when people form a network connection to the printer, they're able to print. Okay, if the IP address constantly was changing, then that printer, they would have to reset up the printer every time they wanted to print to it. Okay, in our case right now, we're just going to do this example with our XP machine here. And right now our IP address we keep getting is 192.168.1.1. Let's say that for some reason we want to set the IP address at 192.168.1.25. We want to make sure that that IP address is always obtained by XP1. What we can do is set up a reservation, and what we need to do is take this MAC address that we see here. This is how the DHCP server is going to match up the computer with the appropriate IP address. Okay, so to do this, we're going to go back over to server 2, and we're going to go here to reservations. Okay, and if I right click, go to new reservation, I can name this reservation. Let's just call it reservation for XP1. IP address we want to give it is 25, and now the MAC address, well, we're going to have to either have a good memory or go back and forth here. Okay, so we have 0000C04F. Let's start with that. Okay, 00C04F 49666A. Okay, 49666A. Is that right? Let's double check that. 49666A. Looks right. Okay, then once we have that, you can put a description if you want. Supported types, it doesn't really matter here. You're not going to be doing boot P only. You could put this if you wanted to, but I would just leave it at both and then click add. Okay. Now when we close it here, we see that we have a reservation for XP1. If we open this up, go to the properties, we see that we have the MAC address inputted here. So let's test this out now that we have this reservation. Let's see if we can actually pick up this IP address. So to do this, what we need to do is go back to our XP1 machine, and we're going to release our current address. Okay, ipconfig release. And now we're going to renew. And when we renew, it's going to be broadcasting out just as if it was rebooting on the network. Okay, and it should, if it matches up that MAC address, if we didn't type it in incorrectly, it should match that up and give us that .25 IP address. Okay, and there you go. It does. 192.168.1.25. We still get our default gateway settings. Let's take a look at our ipconfig all command. When we run this command, take a look at what we receive. We get everything exactly the same. So we're not losing out on those scope options. We get our IP address, mask, gateway, DHCP server, DNS, primary WIN server. The lease has been started over again here at 201. Okay, and the only thing we do get is a consistent IP address. Okay, so on server 2, you can do this with as many different computers as you want to. Maybe instead of having exclusions up here like we were talking about before, you could set up a reservation for each one of these machines. So that's one advantage. Keep that in mind. We are able to set it up at the same IP address, but we can change the other options with the reservation. Okay, if you're trying to figure out why you might want to set up a reservation versus doing it statically, well, here's a good reason. We know we want to keep the same IP address, but these other settings, these may change or fluctuate. Well, it's more automated. If we change these, it's going to affect the reservation as well. We don't have to worry about going around and statically reconfiguring things. Okay, that wraps up Lab 1. We'll see you back here real soon in Lab 2, where we're going to add a second DHCP server. We're going to talk about fault tolerance in DHCP, how to set up multiple scopes to handle one or more subnets.